Thanks so much for your invitation to speak here as part of this Brown Bag lecture series. I'm a bit ill, so I hope my voice will last throughout the talk. The talk is entitled Europe's Failing Project, Migration Struggles, Border Violence and Solidarity Activism. So 2015 is a very historic year of migration. It is historic not merely because of the scale, so the large number of people on the move in the world, but also because we have witnessed, how these many human movements that are often deemed illegal or irregular have by the hundreds of thousands succeeded to overcome one of the most cruel and intricate regimes of population control there is, the European border regime. While accounts differ and sometimes considerably, and so have to be cautiously treated, more than 750,000 people are said to have crossed sea borders into European territory, and more than 600,000 through Greece alone. Once in Greece, and in violation of the so-called Dublin regulation, many travelers decided to move on, especially through the Balkan routes further north. The Dublin regulation, as many of you know, was, or still is, maybe one of the major pillars of the border regime, holding that the first countries of entry are responsible for dealing with asylum claims. And this regulation, of course, placed the major burden on Europe's peripheral states, which were already struck by austerity measures, and at the same time quite often shielding central and northern member states. So this year's unprecedented human mobilities have effectively dismantled this system, even if only temporarily. And what we clearly see now in Europe are very old and known sovereign reflexes. The stationing of military and police forces along border lines, the reinforcement of national boundaries through border fences, border walls, barbed wire and so on. And we also see a surge in right-wing nationalism, populism and racism. These reflexes have immediate consequences, of course. People on the move are now exposed to several regimes of control and to humiliation at Europe's many internal borders. And what we see throughout the continent now are scenes of humanitarian crisis. From Greece, especially from the islands, to Macedonia or Serbia, from Albania to Croatia, Austria and France, to Germany, Denmark, Sweden and elsewhere. And especially now with changing weather conditions and the beginning of the winter season, thousands still stuck in limbo will also face further hardship. On the 27th of August this year, 71 decomposing bodies of mainly Syrian and Iraqi travelers were found in this truck by the Austrian police at the side of the motorway. These bodies in the truck were no longer those that are found along Libyan, Tunisian or Moroccan shores, or those that simply disappear in the sea. But these bodies, while lifeless, had made it into the very core of the European continent, showing that European border violence has in many ways come home and now haunts the project and the very idea of Europe. So I cannot dwell for too long on the reasons why it is now in 2015 that more people are moving toward the continent, but it is clear that a crucial factor for that is the downfall of many of Europe's external frontier guards, connected to, of course, exacerbated regional conflicts that have transformed geopolitical landscapes. Particularly since the Arab uprisings in northern Africa, the likes of Muammar Gaddafi and others have ceased to play the role of Europe's gatekeeper. And Libya has now become the main point of departure for vessels seeking to reach Europe from Africa. Moreover, Europe's eastern neighbors, including the Ukraine and those along the Balkan route, But even countries within the EU, so Greece and Italy, have often become mere transit zones and not spaces of arrested movement, as it had been before. Processes of border externalization were implemented exactly for the purpose to regulate human mobilities from afar and to prevent some movements from occurring in the first place. The violence that these division-making practices always entail were sought to be invisibilized through policy frameworks such as the European Neighbourhood Policy, the global approach to migration and mobility, bilateral partnerships, and of course also through the global visa regime. In light of the wars in Syria and other sources of mass displacement, Europe's machinery of population control has become much more unreliable and unstable, opening up spaces for migration. Or put rather differently, the unabated and very determined movement of people that moved disobediently have created these openings and border subversions. So whenever we open newspapers these days, headlines scream crisis. Europe, so it is often said, has been hit by a migration or a refugee crisis, is overrun by floods of foreigners, and is now at its limits of hospitality. The imaginary and rhetoric of invasion seems reserved for countries from the global north, Europe, Australia, and the US. So what is astonishing is not merely the portrayal of people on the move as crisis-inducing subjects, usually masses of people, but also the purported surprise displayed at these migrations in the first place. Of course, neighboring countries of conflict areas have taken in hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of displaced people for several years. Of the more than 4 million Syrians that have left the country since 2011, more than 2 million moved to Turkey, more than 1 million to Lebanon, more than 500,000 to Jordan, and several hundreds of thousands to Iraq and Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of Eritrean refugees and more than 450,000 South Sudanese refugees have found refuge in Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, and Uganda. The same goes, of course, for refugee populations from Afghanistan and Iraq that have moved into countries nearby. That some of these many millions of displaced populations, and amongst them clearly those that can be understood as echoes of imperial invasion, would also seek to move toward Europe cannot be surprising. So what caught Europe by surprise was not that more people were actually moving toward the continent, but rather that its border regime was unable to continuously deter these populations. The so-called refugee and migration crisis really is a crisis of the European border regime and by extension of the supposedly post-national project of the EU. European governments, EU policymakers and the EU Commission are now quite desperately trying to regain at least the illusion of control and have begun to introduce quite draconian measures that affect migrants and refugees within and beyond EU territory. Throughout Europe, many of the social rights that were struggled for and won by marginalized populations in the past few years are now being revoked. Practices of detention and deportation are strengthened. The mandate of the European Border Agency Frontex is extended, and distinctions between so-called deserving and undeserving migrants become hardened in discourse and in practice. At the same time, the EU again looks outwards and tries to find friends abroad. They've declared several neighboring countries as safe countries of origin, and they're trying to extend that. They've made deals with countries such as Sudan, Eritrea, and Egypt to fight the so-called core root causes of migration. A few weeks ago, when the Turkish military bombed positions of the Kurdish PKK and arrested journalists and critical activists, the red carpet was rolled out in Brussels for the Turkish President Erdogan by EU governments, where deals were made to prevent sea crossings into Europe. So what we have seen unfolding this year is an incredibly complex and dynamic interplay between forces of migration and those of population governance. In my talk today, I will focus especially on this interplay in a particular border zone, the space of the Mediterranean Sea. It is here that border interventions by states, as well as migrant and activist struggles, have taken place with great practical and symbolic relevance. Only last week, a few weeks after the death of the toddler Alan Kurdi had received worldwide media attention, more than 80 people drowned in the Aegean Sea, including more than 30 children. About 39 people died between Spain and Morocco a few days ago, and several dozen corpses were washed up along Libya's beaches in the past few weeks. They're amongst the thousands who have paid attempted sea crossings with their lives. The counted number of deaths by the end of October, more than 3,400, exceeds already the body count of the entire year of 2014. And in the tiny maritime strip between Turkey and Greece, known as, of course, a very desired tourist destination, more than 450 people lost their lives. And actually now there's a problem on Lesbos Island to bury the bodies as the local cemetery is full. Now the Mediterranean Sea is a very peculiar border zone. It is a space where border spectacles continuously occur, which, following Nick DeGenova, refer to the spectacular visibilization of someone's illegality and practices of migration policing. These scenes of exclusionary practice obscenely include illegalized subjects as subordinate and often pitiful victims devoid of political agency. Sea patrols intercepting overcrowded vessels and/or rescuing passengers lend themselves especially well to, I quote Nicholas here, conjure up the fetish of transgression at the ever-multiplying points of interception in an amorphous border zone where migrant trajectories may be interrupted. However, besides this hypervisibilization of overcrowded migrant vessels and EU rescue operations, the Mediterranean is, of course, also a place of invisibilized violence, where year after year, thousands just seem to disappear. So I've argued in some of my work that the ways in which shipwrecks in this Mediterranean Sea are portrayed fall into very ancient ideas of the sea and also of orientalized others. Despite a very long history of human influence on and the shaping of this fluid space, imaginaries of the sea as a void untamable by humankind seem to return when migrant vessels capsize, and especially when migrants drown. As famously evoked by Carl Schmitt, the sea seems uncharacteristic. As unlike on land, he says, on the waves there's nothing but waves. Maritime borders seem particularly difficult to grasp as they appear in tension with traditional conceptions of borders. And of course, these conceptions are not necessarily their realities anymore. In these traditional conceptions, borders are thought of as historic objects engraved in the ground, very solid constructs and markers of sovereign insides and outsides, and usually composed of walls decorated with barbed wires, watchtowers, and state agents who regulate human mobility in the name of a particularly constructed community and territory. So in popular imaginaries of sea crossings, the livelihood of travelers is deemed dependent on the interplay between the vessel, the physical constitution of the travelers, and the biophysical forces of the sea, the current, the cold, the winds, and the waves. Bar these forces, the sea becomes emptied out. It seems primordial, devoid of politics. And when vessels enter such seemingly antithetical space to that of land and carry a freight that is itself quite often thought as a natural force, right? The migrant wave, the migrant flood stream, or even tsunami, their movement, capsizing, and disappearance can easily be connected to registers of fate and dissociated from human action and accountability. Subjected to this ancient idea of the sea, of the lawless sea and its fateful will, shipwrecks and disappeared passengers then become quasi-natural catastrophes. The reactivation of the idea of such idea suits European leaders and policymakers and serves them as a moral alibi, since what emerges through the depiction of the sea as a void is a conception of Europe as a bystander, looking on to unfolding tragedies and the devious actions of so-called smuggling networks. When in 1 week in April alone, more than 1,200 people died in shipwrecks off the coast of Libya, there was a global outcry. People were demanding that Europe should actually do more, that it should abandon its supposedly passive role and intervene more actively. That Europe's entire border architecture relies on the activation of the sea as a deadly space tends to be disregarded. And these narratives, Europe's principal fault in the mass dying lies then in its passivity and not in its strategic exploitation of the sea's murderous potentiality. The imaginary of the sea hides the many activities also of the EU and its member states that create and continuously shape this space as a space of necropolitical migration. It is no news anymore that incremental EU border militarizations and externalizations have coincided with increasing migrant deaths, as routes toward the continent were made more costly, lengthy and dangerous, in effect subsidizing the industry of human smuggling. So EU policymakers and governments have long used the maritime space as a deterrent. And while large-scale naval rescue operations are entirely feasible, they are politically unwanted, as they are quite often seen as a so-called pull factor. Nonetheless, this has not prevented these leaders from, of course, using humanitarian rhetoric to frame and justify militaristic border interventions, some going even as far as portraying human smuggling as the slave traders of the 21st century. That was Italy's prime minister. As a response to one of the largest maritime disasters in the history of the sea, the one in April that I referred to, that occurred also only a few months after the decision was taken by EU leaders to not introduce a naval rescue mission. The EU's Joint Foreign and Home Affairs Council presented a 10-point action plan which read as a humanitarianly worded catalogue of deterrence and border policing. After a shipwreck, that is, right? It proposed the furthering of the militarization of the border zone and its externalization, aimed to preempt attempts to escape, to cross the sea. So, for example, the mandate of Frontex, the European Border Agency, was to be extended, and they openly reject to be understood as a search and rescue agency. Smuggler networks would be targeted, I quote, in a systematic effort to capture and destroy their vessels. Member states and EU agencies would ensure fingerprinting of all migrants and establish a new returns policy for rapid return of irregular migrants. And they are also advocating for new cooperations with third countries. So the policy proposals and the hardened rhetoric really signaled a shift, right? While extended maritime surveillance was also proposed after previous shipwrecks, European institutions and governments now are vowed to military strategies in attempts to destroy these so-called smuggling networks operating in northern Africa, especially in Libya. So on the 22nd of June, the EU launched phase 1 of its naval operation, EU Naval Force Med, short UNAFOR Med, aiming, I quote, to identify, capture and dispose of vessels and enabling assets used or suspected of being used by trafficking networks in the southern central Mediterranean. Phase 1 then prepared phase 2, the seizure of suspicious vessels, and then phase 3, I quote again, the disposal of vessels and related assets, preferably before use, and to apprehend traffickers and smugglers. The military operation prompted disbelief and a strong opposition ever since its intentions were leaked by WikiLeaks about a month before they were officially circulated. So right now, phase 2 was launched a few days ago, and the EU decided to rename its mission. It's not called WatchTheMed anymore, but it is named after a baby that was given birth to by a Somalian woman who was rescued at sea by a vessel part of the military mission. So the military attack on smuggling networks is now called Sophia. So though cautiously framing the operation in these humanitarian terms, its proponents also showed an awareness that such a very aggressive militaristic campaign and the tacitly accepted collateral casualties could also seriously damage the reputation of the EU. So the EU Military Committee recommended, I quote, an information strategy from the outset in order to facilitate expectation management and counter the risk to EU reputation linked to any perceived transgression by the EU force through any public misinterpretation of its tasks and objectives, or the potential negative impact should loss of life be attributed, correctly or incorrectly, to action or inaction by the EU force. So in order to justify the humanitarian war on illegal migration or irregular sea migration that is now unfolding, and also to distance themselves from human rights violations and migrant death at sea, EU institutions and governments engage in a very peculiar politics of selective framing. Connections between structural processes of global inequality and irregular migration, or between the working of border regimes and migrant deaths, have to be avoided. So the blame needs to be shifted toward a particularly constructed enemy against whom a proxy war can be conducted, and that's, of course, the human smuggler. Embedded in humanitarian emergency rhetoric, the very simple and straightforward linkages between, and causalities really, between the closure of land border and sea migration, for example, are not acknowledged. The creation of deadly spaces as the result of the processes of what Etienne Balibar and others have referred to as the effects of global apartheid conditions need to be ignored if these policy proposals and militaristic missions are to be implemented. Of course, these very grotesque truth-making practices, or maybe truth avoidance practices of EU leaders, become increasingly challenged, especially by people on the move themselves, but also by political mobilizations that connect border violence to the activities of the border regime. So when I said that 2015 was a historic year, I was also thinking about the various activist struggles that have materialized throughout Europe and beyond with an unprecedented dynamism. So, and many campaigns have formulated their struggle, especially around and against death at sea. I myself am part of a political collective that has directly intervened in struggles over invisibility and seeks to support seeks to support hidden and irregularized human movements while scandalizing the violence of the border regime. So in many ways, we are trying to reverse the European strategic invisibilization of border brutality and the fetishization of travelers. In order to do that, we have formulated our project around a piece of technology, which is pivotal for contemporary migration journeys, the mobile phone. So the phone line has long formed both a community-creating and community-maintaining device, especially for those moving irregularly. So it has been a help and orienting device, especially after particularly dangerous border crossings. It also serves as a carrier of life signals, of signs of survival. A phone gone silent can have several meanings: confiscation or destruction by border authorities, lack of coverage or credit, loss of the device, or even of its carrier's life. So understanding the importance of this piece of technology for human movements, we launched this so-called WatchTheMed Alarm Phone in October 2014, which functions as a hotline for people in distress at sea. At any point in time, day or night, our shift teams stand ready to answer emergency calls and can, if need be, immediately reach out to multilingual teams and regional experts for assistance. Our network has grown quite tremendously, and we are now about 100 activists located in 10 countries in Europe, Africa, and the US. Sorry, this one. The creation of this network was also inspired by Father Musi Zarai, an Eritrean priest, whose private mobile phone has functioned as an alarm phone, especially for the Eritrean community. And he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize and unfortunately didn't get it. So in months of preparation before the launch, we rehearsed distress scenarios in all 3 regions of the sea. And we collected a wealth of technical and legal knowledges and really created step-by-step emergency instructions. And we also drew a lot of insights from those who had actually done the sea crossings themselves, could tell us their embodied experiences. So I think I'll skip a bit because I'm running out of time. So a crucial component of this phone project was the online monitoring platform called WatchTheMed, founded by Lorenzo Pizzani and Charles Heller. And this platform uses sensing technologies and testimonies of survivors to recreate sea journeys that have ended up in catastrophe. So through their investigations, very detailed maps emerged. I can show you some here, that reconstructed scenes of distress and connected these distress situations to EU Coast Guards and also vessels in vicinity. So this is the trajectory of a migrant vessel, a very famous or infamous case, the Left to Die case, where 63 passengers died despite various encounters at sea with fishing vessels, warships, a helicopter, and so on. So through the alarm phone project, the ability to document human rights violations after the fact turned into a border intervention seeking to prevent these human rights violations to occur in the first place. So we have shown, of course, that the Mediterranean Sea is not a void, but actually a very busy space. The day on which we launched our project was also the anniversary of a very large shipwreck that had caused more than 200 lives. Before capsizing, one of the passengers, called Dr. Mohamed Jammo, he had actually called the Italian Coast Guards, and I have his quote here recalling that. He said, so the officer said, "You are in an area due to the Maltese forces, not to us. You have to call the Maltese Navy." I said to him, "Please, we're dying. You can call the Maltese forces and I will give you the number now." So in quarrels over the question of who would actually take up the responsibility to rescue, a lot of time was lost, and when rescue services then arrived hours later, more than 200 people had drowned, amongst them also Dr. Jammo's 2 little sons. So when we launched this project, we asked this question: what would have happened if the boat people could have directed a second call to an independent phone hotline through which a team of civil society members could raise alarm and put immediate pressure on authorities to rescue? Dr. Jammo and other survivors supported this project, as well as other NGOs, activist networks, and academics throughout the world. Now, back then we knew that sea migration would possibly increase, but we could not anticipate the very magnitude of mobility that we have witnessed this year. Over the summer we had dozens of cases every week from all 3 main regions of the sea. And in the past few months especially, the phone really did not stop ringing. So we had days with more than 20 cases of emergency in 24 hours. In the last week, we worked on a record of 100 cases. So we've been in contact with thousands of travelers on the move, their relatives or families, and we've really heard and learned about their worries. We've created new ties to several activists and human rights groups working in the area. And we've also been in contact with humanitarian vessels that are now operating in the central Mediterranean Sea, for example, by the Doctors Without Borders. We also regularly pass on information to coast guards and try to put pressure on them so that they would actually go out and conduct rescue operations. And we've also documented grave human rights violations at sea, especially in the Aegean Sea. So we've collected testimonies of 24 attacks on refugee vessels. Either special units of the Greek Coast Guard or unidentified actors, often wearing masks, would approach refugee vessels on speedboats, enter their vessels, and take away their engines. At times, travelers were beaten up and their vessels punctured, leaving them behind in distress. In other cases, we learned of very routinely conducted interceptions by the Moroccan Navy that would return especially sub-Saharan travelers back to Morocco. So it is very difficult, and I'm also coming to an end, to summarize the many experiences that we have made in the past year. And some have been really challenging, but some have been also quite uplifting. We had situations where some of our shift teams had to inform relatives and families about losses during the journey. But we also had stories where we could actually follow the trajectories from Turkey to Greece and then throughout Europe until a place where that was desired, where they could reside and quite often reunite with families. So in that sense, I think the Alarm Phone has been quite successful to enter this space of sovereign prerogative, highly undemocratic and hardly accessible to non-state and non-security actors. Creating a presence there and working in the old tradition of flight hub really counters the continuous attempts of European authorities to reactivate the sea as a deadly deterrent. So we understand the sea as a space of political struggle, and travelers, of course, as their protagonists, not as victims devoid of any agency. This year has demonstrated maybe more clearly than ever before that people on the move simply enact their freedom of movement, even if encountering various forms of border violence along their way. It is through political struggles that the sought to be displaced and invisibilized border atrocities are reconnected to the European border regime, and by extension, of course, to the European project. In 2012, when Commission President Barroso back then and Council President Van Rompuy delivered the acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to the EU. This speech was called "From War to Peace, a European Tale." They said, "Over the past 60 years, the European project has shown that it is possible for peoples and nations to come together across borders, that it is possible to overcome the differences between them and us. The criminalization of border crosses, the militarization of global frontiers, the proxy war on so-called smugglers, and the deportation and expulsion of unwanted, often racialized others, expose such idealized European project exactly as a tale." And when I said that the project was failing, I was not meaning to suggest that it is failing because of the disintegration of the European border regime. It is failing because the disobedient movement of people into the very center of the European territory staged collisions between Europe's idea of itself as a cradle of peace, a progressive community, even a normative power in the world, and its very violent realities. Thank you.